Free agency is right around the corner, and by golly, some big names are going to be finding new homes, new roles, and maybe new places that can help their fantasy success or drown it. Maybe it turns out terrible. We will find out very, very soon. But before finding out, it is time to make some big-time predictions on these very subjects. That's right, guys. Myself and Dwain, the Rock McFarland, in here letting you guys know where we think some of the biggest names hitting the open market could be winding up. So, Dwain, let's get after it, starting things off with the former RB1 of the Packers and most recently the Vikings, Aaron Jones, hitting free agency, albeit after he had himself a pretty nice year wearing purple.
Yeah, I mean, look, Aaron Jones handled 60% of the team's attempts this year. Ian, I'm obviously adjusting for the games that he didn't play, but he showed like he could still handle the workload. I think the real question is like some of the efficiency, right? It's starting to slip. Now, we've talked about this in the past, like how much does efficiency really matter in fantasy football? It's not huge. It's really more of a tiebreaker, but it is something that we do have data points that are sticky to the running back year over year, meaning we can use it to kind of predict like where are they at, right? In their journey as a running back and yards after contact, explosive rush rate, missed tackles forced. Like he's not at his peak, right? Where he was 3 or 4 years old. Obviously, he'll be almost 31 years old when the season starts this next year. So I think age is the primary concern here with Aaron Jones. But I think the big plus that we're getting here, and love to hear your thoughts, like from a receiving perspective, still grading out in that running back one territory. When you look at his yards per route run, targets per route run, those numbers are still really holding up. So if you feel like he can handle some volume, you feel like he's a guy that could also be on the field in passing downs, I do think he's one of the names, even though he's 31 years old. If you've got the money, right? Maybe you're a competitive team and you're needing a running back, or you want to add another running back to your room. I do think that Aaron Jones is one of the top names to consider of a fairly weak free agency class.
To get that recent influx with the league-wide salary cap, I guess some of the ratings starting to take into account the streaming services and things of that nature. So maybe teams will be a bit more, willing to spend some of that extra cash on guys like Aaron Jones. But you said it, Dwain, every single running back we talk about, we are going to have to add in the caveat that, yes, certainly understand that would make sense if teams are going to be going a bit more, hard in the paint to fill these holes in the NFL draft. But again, going back to Aaron Jones, you mentioned the 31 here next December. He does have, quite a bit of mileage at this point. I mean, 1,755 career touches. That's less than Christian McCaffrey, not too much more than guys like James Conner, Austin Eckler, David Montgomery, albeit they have also been around for quite some time. So I'm with you. Seems like the receiving work at this point is still where he can really hang his hat on things. Honestly, I'd be fine seeing him going back to Minnesota and probably just re-racking things there. And that would be my prediction here overall, Dwain. I'm not sure if they're going to add another, day 2 pick at the position. Not exactly loaded up with draft capital in Minnesota these days. Cam Akers, obviously a longtime BFF of Kevin O'Connell. Maybe we see a bit more of a 1-2 punch there. Honestly, kind of like we did down the stretch of last season. But for my money's worth, as someone that maybe does have Aaron Jones on a dynasty squad here or there, I would say returning home to the Minnesota Vikings, probably best for his fantasy stock in 2025.
Yeah, that would be my call too. Like the teams I kind of put in a bucket like that would work. So they've got the money, they need a running back, and they're competitive. That would be the Chargers and the Vikings. Obviously, the Chargers could decide to bring back J.K. Dobbins, a guy we'll talk about in a minute. They could draft someone like you said, but they technically fit the bill. The Vikings are a team. Then I had another bucket of they've got the money. They could use a running back. Like they don't have to have one, but they are also competitive. The Steelers, because if they let Najee Harris move along, depending on how they feel about Jaylen Warren, I think you and I, we're Jaylen Warren truthers. We'd rather see Jaylen Warren get that chance, and then they could maybe supplement him in the draft. But like technically they could fit into this, conversation. The Commanders are another one, just depending on how they feel about Brian Robinson Jr. at this point. And then the Bears, right? You've got DeAndre Swift there, but they do have the money, and I don't know that they're necessarily hitched to DeAndre Swift. So I think those would be the other teams. You tell me what you think, but I don't see a team that's got the money that needs a running back, but they're not competitive right now, probably being in on Aaron Jones. So that would be the Raiders, the Giants. And then you have some other teams that like they could probably use him, but where are they going to sign him from? They have no money, and that's the Chiefs as well as the Cowboys.
I do think our next running back actually could be someone who gets maybe a surprising sort of dollar deal that we didn't see coming, and that is former Steelers RB Najee Harris. Dwayne, you mentioned Jaylen Warren hitting free agency. He is doing so the restricted variety, so there's a bit better chance we see him still wearing black and yellow in 2025. Najee, however, is hitting that open market. And on the one hand, I get it. Hasn't exactly been, the sexiest fantasy pick in recent years. He's someone that we don't exactly associate with having this, one-hitter quitter, big play, explosive explosiveness these days. But on the other hand, Dwayne, the guy still hasn't missed an NFL game. Best availability is best. Oh my gosh, best ability is availability. There we go. Ian got it on the third try, as we know after all. Also, only running back in the NFL with 1,000+ rushing yards in each of the last 4 seasons. Do you think we could maybe, just maybe, Dwayne, see Najee go from, let's face it, not exactly the world's best offensive environment in Pittsburgh, land somewhere else, and all of a sudden almost have a second contract revival a la David Montgomery?
Yeah, I think it could happen. I mean, we know that volume really is the key for running backs, and Najee is the archetype back that if a team wanted to sign him and load him up with all the work, we've seen him be able to handle it. He can handle the passing downs. He can handle the early down running stuff. He can handle the stuff down inside the 5. Like you said, not saying he's great in any of those areas, right? If you're really grading him out, like historically speaking, from an efficiency standpoint, he's more of a running back 2 or 3. His receiving chops are more of a running back 2, running back 3. But he's capable in all those areas. So like I could see a coach trusting him in and letting him play all those downs. I think the Chargers, going back to teams that have the money, that are competitive, like Najee would be an interesting name there. Kind of fits like what we would think from a Harbaugh, style offense. I could see that being something, and he's only going to be, well, he'll be 27 and a half when the season starts next year. So he is the younger back, right, out of a lot of these players that you would be picking through, that also has shown that he can handle that complete workload. So I do think in the right landing spot, like we could start to get a little bit more excited about Najee.
He does run violent, man. He's been a long-time hurdler, or even going back to his days at Alabama, which maybe I, subconsciously, bias a little bit more. Got some trouble with Alexander Madison once or twice over the years. But, just looking again at Najee, having that ability to break tackles, that would almost, Dwayne, you mentioned before, some of these factors where, yeah, I get it, guys, fell into the hole a little bit last year. Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, they didn't have great advanced metrics, but they were also in really bad offensive environments. We learn, we get better, we watch the film, yada, yada, yada. But if you just had to, Dwayne, kind of place your chip on either that explosive ability, the tackle breaking ability, or the yards after contact metrics, which one would it be? Because the one thing where Najee actually has been borderline elite over the years is that, missed tackles force rate.
Yeah, the missed tackles force and the yards after contact are the two that stick with the player most year over year. So I think those are the two you've got to pay attention to the most. The explosive play rate is really where you can start to get more added value to the player, but it also can be so inconsistent year over year. Even if you think you've got a guy that's explosive, it's not unsurprising for him to suddenly have a year where he only breaks 10% of his carries go for 10+ yards instead of 15%. It's real easy to have these big swings in that area. So like theoretically, I like the big playability. I think that's what the teams like. But as far as which things are the most predictive year over year, it is the missed tackles force and the yards after contact.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. You threw the Chargers out there as a potential landing spot. I am with you. That would make a lot of sense. But how about those Chicago Bears? Because DeAndre Swift, as much as he and Ben Johnson did have their time together in Detroit, not exactly the sort of back that you would think Ben wants to exactly lean on for early downs. Maybe he wants to go ahead and get himself a new and improved, would have been Jamal Williams at that point, in the form of Najee Harris. Because, again, guys, David Montgomery's been fantastic the last 2 years. I get it. But you look at the side-by-side with his numbers during his first 4 years in Chicago compared to what Najee was doing in Pittsburgh, and they're either identical or, in favor of Najee. Najee actually leads the way in explosiveness, forcing missed tackles, picking up yards after contact. Now, both guys average 3.9 yards per carry, which is not a great starting point, I admit. But as Dwayne said, we do have the history of Najee catching, 74 passes as a rookie, having that, theoretical 3-down ability. So Chicago Bears offense hopefully finally moving in the right direction. No, I don't think he's exactly walking into a Detroit Lions level offensive line like Monty, so that is where the comparison could fall flat a bit. But again, if I was going to be placing a chip, maybe on one of these running backs, still finding a way to have that true workhorse, fantasy-friendly role here in 2025, I think Najee could be that guy, pal. Let's talk about maybe a more underrated running back fitting that mold, Dwayne. And it is, our fellow, both of our, I guess, favorite team, the Dallas Cowboys reigning leading rusher, Rico Dowdle, 10th man in team history with over 1,000 rushing yards in the season. Now, didn't even have the full-time starting job until week 8 or week 9, whenever the Cowboys finally decided to be done with old man Zeke out there. But Rico, despite operating behind the league's second worst offensive line, rushing yards before contact per carry, did a lot of good things out there, Dwayne. Do you think we're maybe underrating the potential for Rico to go find himself a new home and maybe take over the backfield?
Yeah, I think you're right on the underrated part. It's hard to know, like, can he do this over the long term? And will any team that's out there see him this way? I could also see Rico just get completely ignored in free agency. But if a team is into some of the underlying data points, and we know that some of them are, I think there is some room. Number one, we did see him handle a larger portion of the workload. You talked about it down the stretch. He was pretty much the guy for the Cowboys. So he's proven that he can do that. And then the next thing is just really looking at what he did from, an explosive carry rate, yards after contact, missed tackles forced per attempt. Really, he graded out in running back one territory. And the way I handle that is I look back all the way to 2011, and I've come up with the averages for running backs that are finishing in the top 12. And he's like right there at those thresholds for all those things. So I was even a little surprised. I thought Rico, I don't know, and it's probably like, recency bias. I just hadn't thought about it, but it was like, oh, he got the volume in the Cowboys offense and that led to some points, but he was actually pretty efficient to your point. So I do think that there is a little bit that's potentially underrated here. It's just a matter of, does another team really believe that season worth of work? And that's really going to be that'll be the biggest factor, because is it somewhere where he gets to go and land that he would be clearly stepping into a potential big role like what he had with the Cowboys at the end of the year? Or is he a guy that someone doesn't want to spend a lot of money on and he comes in more as a backup or a handcuff to someone else?
And that is the whole kind of, I guess, question with the Cowboys and the whole Ashton Genty at number 12, kind of scenario. Because I remember like when Zeke got drafted and he was 4th overall. I know there's a difference between that and 12th. But when these running backs actually surprisingly fetch that first round money, they immediately become some of the highest paid players at the position. And the Cowboys, man, already, in the negative in terms of their 2025 cap space. Doing the math right now, I believe they're 26 right now, squeezed between the Texans and the Dolphins. So if the Cowboys don't want to, again, be signing up for Genty, who great player and everything, not debating that, but you can only pay so many guys. I didn't watch the Cowboys last year, Dwayne, and say, man, if they just had a better running back, all of a sudden everything would just be so much better for this group. So maybe we could be, underrating, a bit of a just hometown bargain deal for Rico, particularly if he doesn't fetch a bunch of money out there. I mean, as a Cowboys fan, Dwayne, take your fantasy hat off for a second. Would you be okay with the Cowboys bringing back Rico Dowdle and using, a day 2 or day 3 pick on the position as opposed to spending high on someone like Genty?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as high as some folks are on this running back class, but it's definitely deep, right? There are multiple guys that could come in and form a platoon and maybe eventually take over the backfield. Genty's clearly like he's the crown jewel of the class. And then there's a big drop, but you've got multiple guys that grade out in the rookie supermodel over the 60th percentile. And historically, quite a few of those guys do end up going on to become running back 2s or running back 1s. So some of them are going to hit. And I do think that the Cowboys could take that approach where they wait until day 2, maybe even day 3, because there are so many. It'll be interesting to see like how far do they slide. Will the teams play a game of chicken and keep waiting, or will they start taking them early and they'll all get gobbled up sooner? We don't know for sure, but a lot of times when you've got a position where there's a lot of availability, right, and the market is flush, teams will try to wait and they'll try to kind of play chicken, almost like fantasy drafters with quarterbacks, right? And you're waiting until the other person to say, okay, now I'm in this other tier where I've got to grab my quarterback. Teams do that sort of thing in the NFL draft. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But yeah, I actually think that returning to the Cowboys is probably the best scenario for Rico Dowdle, because they've already seen it from him. So they're going to trust him, and he would have a chance if they do take a round 2 or round 3 player. He would have a chance to compete with them and potentially even hold on to the starting job if that player struggled in training camp. So I do like the call for the Cowboys.
Far more times than not, regardless of what player we were talking about, returning home is going to be best for their long-term future. And we've consistently seen those sort of players perform better in the future. Again, I saw what happened, like we all did, with Jacobs, Saquon, and Henry last season. Just realized that was a bit of a unique circumstance. Exactly. Yeah. So we'll see, again, if the Cowboys can figure something out with Dowdle or who else. But we talked about some of these teams, the Raiders, the Cowboys, the Vikings, and also the Chargers as being some of the most, RB-friendly homes, potential lead backs. So that takes us to our 4th running back we wanted to talk about, Mr. J.K. Dobbins, one of the best comeback stories of the 2024 season. Got banged up a little bit down the stretch, found his way back into the lineup, so wasn't able to make it a full 17 games with good health. But at least Dwain did enough to go out there and just prove that he can still be a guy, and his scheme won't give him a chance. And obviously last year with the Chargers, a big reason why people weren't, overly onto him in early preseason drafts was, 1, coming back from his just plethora of just brutal lower leg injuries, and 2, the Chargers only gave the man $50,000 in guaranteed money. So certainly thinking that number is going to be getting quite a bit higher. That said, I'm not also expecting Dobbins to be fetching $8 or $10 million a year or anything like that. So looking at the Chargers, man, like their running backs as a whole weren't very good last year, but man, I'm just using yards per carry. Understand it's not the fanciest stat in the world, but when we can use it for guys in the exact same offense and the same environment, I think it's a little more telling. And just to see Dobbins at 4.6 compared to Gus Bus at 3.6, and same thing with Kamani Vidal, I mean, he was making far more out of his opportunities than those other backs, Dwain. So personally, I would like to see Dobbins get a chance to return to Los Angeles. Maybe not, again, be this 300 touch lead back, but man, God forbid he gets a little more explosiveness back in year 2 removed from, again, some of those lower body issues. There could still be a nice little ceiling here.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking about a guy that'll be almost 27 when the season starts next year. He'll be 26.8 technically, Ian. But he did a lot of nice things this year. I think the big question teams will have is back to that availability question. Do they think that Dobbins can stay healthy? Obviously, battled some things this last year. You and I talk about this all the time. We've got quite a few players over the course of history where they've been injured until they weren't, and then suddenly 3 or 4 years in a row they're just fine. Can J.K. Dobbins be one of those players? He is young enough that I think it could make some sense for a team to place, a small to medium-sized bet on J.K. Dobbins as someone that could come in and help their backfield. Maybe it's a return to the Chargers. But even on that explosive rush rate, he was sitting at 14%. The league average is 9.5%. I mean, we're talking about J.K. Dobbins in the years where he's played at least 8 games. He's been 15%, 17%, and like I mentioned this last year, 14%. So while he might not have hit the complete home run on several of those, he was still, he was stacking up carries of 10+ yards or more, much more than the league average. So I think that that's very encouraging. Yards after contact, also above where we're typically at for the league average. Missed tackles forced per attempt, right around the league average. And if you look at J.K. Dobbins over his 3 years, he was at his career averages, though, on those things. So as much as people might want to look at it and say, oh, he's washed, like he was a lot closer to his former self than some of these other backs that we've talked about that have come back from injury or have been getting a little bit older. Like he was really close to the J.K. Dobbins that we saw before. So I think it will just come down to what does a team think about the injury history, and are they willing to bring him into a scenario where he'll have a chance to be the lead back, or will it be more as a committee? Right. And I think there's a good chance that it ends up being as a committee back. But I do think that Dobbins, of everybody we've talked about, if he suddenly stayed healthy and he was good to go, I think he might actually be the best one of this class, especially considering what you'd have to pay for him.
And that was the thing. The only really part of his game that we didn't see come back to fruition last year was just that long speed, kind of that, 20 to 40 yard speed, because he still gets a nice explosive play rate, as you mentioned, racking up these 10+ yard gains. But it was once you really saw him break into the open field, maybe getting hawked by that safety that we wouldn't have expected a few short years ago when he was making dudes miss down there in Columbus. So overall in the season, though, again, the advanced stats really do paint a favorable picture. 10th in rushing yards over expected per carry. I was a bit of a dick and used a cutoff of like 175. So with all due respect to the Tank Bigsby's and Antonio Gibsons of the world, I'm going to list the only guys in front of him, Dwain, and they're all really good running backs. I mean, Derrick Henry, Saquon, Chuba, Bucky, Gibbs, Cook, Jacobs, Bijan, Jonathan Taylor themselves. I mean, that's a good group to be a part of. And again, I would be surprised if Dobbins is out there fetching more than 4 to 6 million, year over year in the open market. So maybe back in Los Angeles, again, I do think that would probably be his best case. But yeah, I think we're buying some J.K. Dobbins stock ahead of 2025. Love to see those injury gods, proven wrong at least here for a little bit as I knock on wood. So just quickly joining on the topic of some of those injuries, because you brought up the point where it's, I think I saw Dr. Jeff Mueller at JM Thrive PT on Twitter. Fantastic follow. Love everything Jeff does. But we're going to get to the point soon in the offseason where it's like, oh, Saquon Barkley. Okay, look at all these touches he had. And yeah, I said he couldn't stay injured last year, and I said he couldn't stay healthy last year, and he did. But I'll bet you even more he can't stay healthy after that. I mean, when you start going through projections and rankings, like where does age and wear and tear actually stick out? Because, guys like CMC, guys like Henry, guys like Saquon, it worked out for the vast majority of them last year, but as we know, not always the case year over year.
Yeah, and we've got that elite 2017 class still hanging on, Ian. Now, CMC obviously missed most of this last season, but we got a lot of really good running backs. Joe Mixon's in that mix. We've got Alvin Kamara sitting in that group. Leonard Fournette already gone. He exited the chat, a couple of years ago. But we've got a lot of guys that are just sitting there, and where people are having to take them right now in fantasy drafts, you're looking at the end of round 1, early round 2. So I get it. You got to think about it because there's trade-off costs. Like, do you want to take a young ascending receiver like maybe a Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors, or do you want to take the older running back? That's kind of the situation that folks are being forced into. But I did a full article on this last year about really where those cliff years occur for running backs. And all of these guys that we're talking about, besides Dobbins, and Dobbins is fine. Najee Harris is still in a fine territory. Rico Dowdle in fine territory. But Aaron Jones, a lot of these other guys that people are having to make choices on at that 1-2 turn, I mean, they're in the area where they're not going to be what they once were, right? I mean, Derrick Henry is in a very good situation, So, I mean, obviously, I saw your tweet with the Lamar Jackson effect. It was good. It's good for Derrick Henry. It's good for everybody. But they can still be productive. It doesn't mean that just because they fall off a little bit that they're suddenly over with. Now, the thing that does happen that we can't always predict is we don't know for sure where the cliff is going to come. And a lot of these guys are now in that range. Of this group of guys that we just talked about, it's really Aaron Jones. That's where he's the one that's in that range of potentially just falling off the cliff. And we might not even be able to see it coming. But again, a lot of these guys, Ian, you know how it works. They keep surviving. And these are really good players. These aren't just typical running backs. These are guys that they changed the league in a way, right? And they definitely changed fantasy fortunes as far as their skill sets go. So with those, in my opinion, right, based on the data I've looked at, you also have to think about what's the starting point for the player and how good they were at their height. And then they've got more cushion to come down from that if they were a really good player. If you've got a player that was a borderline running back too, and all of a sudden they start to devolve, well, like, you don't have as much of a cushion. But we're talking about some players that are really good.
And again, also some of these, more outlier scenarios that just happened. They're really good players that just went to really good teams and really good franchises that, again, I think allow us to have that much more trust in the overall situation. So I'm sure we'll have plenty more conversations around that very topic throughout the rest of the offseason. Today, they'll still have plenty of wide receivers we want to get to in their potential landing spots in free agency right after a quick word from our friends over at Bud Light.
Hey, you're not actually allowed to drink in a beer commercial?
Since when?
You gotta wait till it's done. Oh,
5,
4, 3, 2, 1.
Maybe the crown jewel of the wide receiver class at this point, because T. Higgins is expecting to be franchise tagged. Looks like Buccaneers wide receiver Chris Godwin. So Dwain certainly, had that incredible season cut short, unfortunately, by that dislocated ankle issue. We'll see how he recovers throughout the offseason, but so far it's looking okay. Dr. Deepak Chona, very good follow on the old Twitter sphere as well. He believes Godwin will likely be playing in week 1 of 2025. Did note that wide receiver ankle data favors a moderate dip that recovers mid-season, but we still have top bowls, even not exactly ruling out a return and a deep playoff run for Godwin as well. So putting the whole injury issue aside for a second, Chris Godwin, Dwain, do you see him going back to Tampa Bay here, or could this be the guy that Patriots fans and some of these other just wide receiver desperate teams out there can maybe sink their teeth into?
Yeah, I think there could be more of a bidding war here, right? I mean, if you look at Godwin, he's going to be 29.6, so almost 30 years old when the season starts next year, but still coming off of a really good year. To your point, the injury shortened season, some teams will look at that. That may bother them, but 19.7 fantasy points per game. That's the most since 2019, whenever he scored 19.6. He's also got a 17.6 fantasy point per game on his resume. So he's come through with some, from a fantasy perspective, with some wide receiver 1 performances in the past. You kind of look at the underlying data. It also really supports, Ian, what we saw, in the box score, which is the best way to really use this data. You want to just check and see if, okay, great. They did really well in fantasy, but was it due to some sort of outlier thing, like just touchdowns, things like that? But yards per route run, 2.36, also a career high. Going back to 2019, he was at 2.24. Targets per route run, 25%. He was actually paced for a 27% target share per the utilization report. So yeah, Chris Godwin still really balling, a guy that plays either the Z or he plays at the slot, can kick inside whenever you go to your 3 wide receiver stuff. Just a complete mismatch nightmare against linebackers, safeties, understands how to work the zones. And this last year, man, he was really impressive, on all fronts, whether he was facing man coverage or zone coverage. 26% targets per route run against man. The year before that, it was 18, and the year before that was 19. So some of those changes that he saw, with Liam Cohen, that's the question. If he does return to the Bucs, how much does the offense change? I'll tell you right now, if I'm the new offensive coordinator, I would just keep doing what they were doing because they had a really good offense. Fine, you want to add your wrinkles, you got to have your, you want to make your imprint on the offense. You can do that, but also like you just have an offense that was really humming last year. So I would love to see him return to the Bucs and get to play with Mike Evans and play with Baker Mayfield and how well he's doing. I just drafted him in our Fantasy Life mock draft. There'll be more on that coming out later this week. You guys will see a write-up on it, but I did draft Chris Godwin in that draft. So yeah, I absolutely love him, Ian. I do think the bidding war could happen though, because we've got some teams that have money. And I think that what changes it is it doesn't just have to be the competitive teams, because you could also, so there's the Commanders, Chargers, Steelers, Rams, Broncos. I think they could all in one way, shape, or form be in the market for a guy like Chris Godwin. But then you also have the teams that have the cap, they need a wide receiver and they're not competitive, but they want to help their quarterback, the Patriots, right? So Drake May, he would love to be throwing to a guy like that. I mean, you've got the Panthers. Might be too much overlap with what you have with Adam Thielen, who's on the last year of his deal. But the Panthers did say they're bringing him back. Maybe that would change if they were able to get Chris Godwin. So he's going to be a really interesting name to watch. I agree with you. I think that by far, like this is the name to watch as far as wide receivers go, with T. Higgins most likely back with the Cincinnati Bengals.
Just mentioned several good potential other teams too. Like again, probably returning to Tampa Bay is going to be his best bet. We saw what he can do in this offense, even without Liam Cohen. They did go ahead and just upgrade from within with their new offensive coordinator. But obviously Baker Mayfield's still around as well. But otherwise, man, I think we could talk ourselves into the Rams replacing Cooper Kupp as their slot, getting a lot of the old Robert Woods sort of packages as a complement to Puka Nacua. We can see him in Denver, maybe just displacing Courtland Sutton as the number one target earner, getting a lot of fun screens, Sean Payton just design goodness there. And also in Washington being the number two to Terry McLaurin, if not the number one there, feasting on some of those RPOs and just quick hitting concepts from Cliff Kingsbury. So again, Dwain getting a little bit longer in the tooth here, and we do need to realize that coming off that dislocated ankle isn't ideal, but just the way he's worn in the past, it's not like Chris Godwin's just been running by dudes in recent years anyway. He's already had a fair share of injuries. He's been more of this rugged, possession receiver, the, older school Larry Fitz, the 2014, 2015 version of Larry Fitz out there anyway. So man, it's one of those things where like, if your offense can't figure out how to, fit Chris Godwin into it, maybe you should be the one figuring things out.
Well, we have three kind of similar archetypes of wide receivers that are available, right? Stefon Diggs, he'll be almost 32 years old when the season starts next year. Keenan Allen will be 33 years old. And really at this point, those guys are all going to be more your Z and the option to kick inside, right, to the slot. So Chris Godwin, he's the youngest of all those. Not only did he perform the best, like out of all those players, he's also the youngest. So I think he's going to get his money, whether it's with, the Tampa Bay Bucs or not. And to your point, Ian, I do believe that the way he plays, stylistically, the way he wins is something that can last. And you mentioned it. We've seen that with Larry Fitzgerald in the past. We've seen that with Hines Ward. That's another name that we like to bring up.
Yeah.
Heck, even Reggie Wayne, played outside his whole career, kicks inside for that rookie year with Andrew Luck and has a great year as well. So I think all these guys could potentially do it, but Godwin is the one I would feel the best about because he still is the youngest of this trio that we've got to talk about.
I will say sometimes the whole like, hey, it's a slot receiver now, it gets a bit overstated. Yes, Godwin played the majority of his snaps in the slot last year, but it was 243 in the slot versus 153 out wide. Okay, this wasn't, this 90%, route rate inside or anything. So he can play the Z, he can move over. I wouldn't, just look at him and maybe the Chargers and be like, oh, they already have Lab McConkey, they can't figure it out. A lot of these teams nowadays almost take a page out of the Chiefs playbook and, move them around a bit more, I guess, than we would expect. But Dwain, I know in recent weeks you've been a bit more in the lab with your, rookie wide receiver supermodel, RB and tight end as well, coming very soon to fantasylife.com. But again, talking about someone who can play the Z, can play in the slot, he can, help in the block game, maybe get him a few carries. Yes, it is Ohio State's finest, Emeka Egbuka. Do you think this is actually?
I knew this was going
comparison?
Here.
Of course. Why wouldn't
I
it
saw
go?
you setting yourself up. I saw it.
What do you think, though? I mean, it is a pretty good comp.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, I like him, and I think that is a good stylistic comp. He's a name I actually threw out in a kind of a Twitter exchange this weekend as being someone else that you could comp to Egbuka. The thing I would say, you talked about earlier with the running backs and how deep that class is and how that could influence the way teams are going to think about the running back position. It could cause some of these guys to have to wait. At the wide receiver position, it's not as deep. While we do have a guy, in Emeka Egbuka that could be a good fit for someone like the Bucs or whoever wants to play someone in a role like a Chris Godwin. It's not as deep, right? Once you get through the first 3 to 4 wide receivers, and it's not helping us that Travis Hunter's most likely going to play cornerback. So that takes him off the board as the top wide receiver in the class. But this isn't as deep, near as deep, right, as last year. So there could be a little bit more market here for these wide receivers versus what we're seeing with the running backs. And then obviously we've just seen the league be more willing to pay wide receivers even a little bit later into their career than what we've seen with running backs. So I think the market dynamics work more in favor of these veteran wide receivers that are free agents. But yes, Ian, yes, I love Emeka Egbuka, and I do think that he has a lot to offer.
Final note on Godwin. We did actually see, a move recently where the Bucs and Godwin agreed to basically move his void date of his contract to March 12th, seemingly buy some time to maybe work out a new deal and avoid letting him hit free agency. But again, if Godwin just, doesn't think there's enough zeros or commas in that deal, maybe he goes ahead and tests that open market because, again, really does look like the biggest name out there because some of these other guys we're going to get to, even older in our next case, coming off injury as well. So, Dwain, let's talk some Stefon Diggs, someone who obviously last year was having to adjust to a new environment in Houston. But man, before that injury, he was looking like the same old Stefon Diggs. So I understand, the end of 2023 didn't go all that well in Buffalo, but that was also a situation that we talked through a number of times where really the underlying numbers for Diggs were fine. And we were just starting to see Joe Brady in that, really run first Bills offense rear its ugly head for those wide receivers involved. So last season, again, small sample size be damned here, we saw Stefon Diggs ranked 7th among all qualified wide receivers in ESPN's open score, meant to help, just quantify separation ability out there. So Stefon Diggs coming off the torn ACL, he's going to be 32 next November. There are some red flags here, Dwain, but if we can get even just that guy that we saw in September last year, maybe Green Bay finally gets themselves a real number 1 wide receiver.
Yeah, Diggs is an interesting one. I do have some concerns. Like if we look at his yards per route run, and 3 out of the last 4 seasons, Ian, he's been under 2. And he's played with good quarterbacks. So typically when we see something like that and we're like, okay, well, they played with, whoever, name the worst quarterback. They played with Anthony Richardson. Sorry, Richardson, catching strays. We talked positive about you on a podcast previously. Playing with a good quarterback and doing that, that's troublesome. And then the other component of it is, and this is some research I did last year, and like anything, nothing's perfect because Devontae Adams completely blew it up. But Stefon Diggs has not been very good against man coverage, man. 1.65 yards per route run. Then he had a boom year in 2022 of 2.65, but the last 2 years, 1.88 and 1.56. So I do wonder, some of that separation ability, even though it's getting, I hear you, the metric from ESPN looks pretty good on the surface. I get a little bit concerned when I see that because some of the research that I did just really pointed towards, man, when they start deteriorating against man coverage, that can be problematic. So that's my biggest concern with Stefon Diggs. I do think his best fit at this point is probably playing in the slot, seeing some of this data.
Would be great to see him again try to regain some of that, pre-2023 form. Was just, a yearly lock for 100 catches, 1,200 plus yards, 8 plus touchdowns. But yeah, not given those efficiency numbers are going down. And to your point, can't really point the finger somewhere else. So hopefully Diggs gets that knee right and everything. But yeah, bigger story here again would be that potential fit for the Green Bay Packers, finally getting them a true number 1 wide receiver. Maybe next year is the year that Dontavian Wicks becomes Jerry Rice, Dwain. I know everyone's hoping that that's going to be the case. But, just even beyond that thing, with Christian Watson, his dad coming out there on Twitter and basically saying not expecting him back until November or December. Romeo Dobbs, obviously not exactly being, this, key number 1. Jaden Reed, more of a slot guy. The Packers got to do something here. Even if it's not Diggs, I'd really like to see them upgrade elsewhere.
Yeah, and we'll talk in a minute. I like Amari here just because I feel a little better about his ability to still play outside, a little bit younger. I do think there's a little bit of risk with Diggs unless you're going to let Jaden Reed play outside, which I'm all for. Let's let him try it, guys. Let's, as Ian likes to say, let's put Jaden Reed on the field for 90% route participation, and let's just see what happens. Let's see where the chips fall. I would love to see that, but if they're going to keep him inside in the slot, then I worry. Is Diggs really up to the task of playing outside and really being as dominant as what he once was? And if not, then you're kind of back where you were, just a bunch of guys mixed together if Diggs doesn't show that he still has that old gear that we got used to for so long early in his career at Minnesota and then later in Buffalo.
Another wide receiver whose best days are probably in the slot these days, but maybe still has some juice. Keenan Allen there for your Chicago Bears. Maybe he will be returning to Chicago, but he's actually already on record saying if it's not going to be the Bears, he would like to return to Los Angeles and play for either the Rams or the Chargers. So interesting fits all around because, Dwayne, we did see a stretch last season where Keenan was looking a lot like the old Keenan. I know you brought up during the year, maybe we just simply weren't giving him enough credit for playing through that early season heel injury because, man, I'm looking at it right now from weeks 12 through 16 last year. Yes, it's an arbitrary cutoff. I get it. That's what it's freaking February. Okay. That's what we do in these parts of the year. We do arbitrary cutoffs to prove our point. Only 5 wide receivers have more PPR points than Keenan Allen, Dwayne. I mean, I know you were a fan. Everyone was a fan of that cool little double pivot route he pulled off against the Lions to get free. Like Keenan Allen, okay, he's not blazing past defenders these days, but at the same time, you put him in that Chargers offense again, which would be cool. You put him in that Rams offense to replace Cooper Kupp. Or you have Ben Johnson giving him all right, I'll say it even though it's different, giving him the Amon-Ra St. Brown role. It'd be a good time. There's a lot of good options here, Dwayne.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good options for Keenan. Now, I mean, the big thing is going to be 33 when the year starts. So he's definitely in that territory where a cliff can happen at any moment. So it's going to push him down fantasy draft boards, which is good. We don't want to be taking Keenan early in drafts this year. But to your point, like he did play well enough down the stretch, had that 27% target share. The difficulty with Keenan when you're evaluating him, looking at the rest of the underlying data points, as well as the fantasy points per game, is we don't know for sure, Ian, how much of that is he could be deteriorating versus Caleb Williams just had a really bad year, you know, compared to, and maybe we got too hyped on Caleb Williams, but compared to where our expectations were for him, he did not perform well. And really it held down all the wide receivers for the Bears. Now, the targets were still there, whether it was against man, whether it was against zone. Man targets per route run, 25% for Keenan. He was at 20% against zone. They were using more of DJ Moore underneath the coverage, giving him all those kind of gadgety plays this year. You guys saw all that unfolding. So with Keenan, he's kind of like what you talked about with Chris Godwin, but he's older. But the way he wins, it's not with speed, right? It's with his savviness. It's with his quickness, which is obviously that's going down a little bit. But what he understands from a way the game works sort of thing. If he got paired with a good quarterback, I would still feel good about Keenan Allen. I would rather it not be in a situation where we've got 2 other wide receivers that we're also having to feed. But Keenan also, man, he could spell trouble for anywhere else that he lands, because you do have to worry that he could just come out there and get that 25% target share. But just kind of looking at it, like the Chargers, I don't think they would do it, Ian. Like you got Ladd McConkey. Like why would you want to do that? And I know Ladd's playing outside, but the Rams one is kind of interesting. Because it is literally Cooper Kupp, you know. Now here's the thing. Cooper Kupp last year still had the targets overall. They deteriorated down the stretch, but he wasn't doing anything with them. And that's really the question here with Keenan Allen. Like, is he entering a phase where he can get the targets but not really do anything with them? And we don't know for sure because of the Caleb Williams question.
And the whole thing, you know, because I was actually floating out Keenan Allen to the Rams over on the old Twitter sphere. I like hearing, you know, the feedback, especially, you know, from Rams fans out there and stuff. And the initial thing was like, okay, well, Keenan doesn't block well enough to be in there. Is that really something that's going to completely separate it? Because I know Puka is going out there and doing his thing, you know, in the dirty, you know, trenches, Kupp, run blocking and all that. But was Cooper Kupp really, you know, just the best blocker in the league over these past 2 years anyway? So, yeah, Keenan Allen, it would feel a little weird, Dwayne, like to get rid of 130 plus something wide receiver and just bring in another one. Why wouldn't you just keep Cooper Kupp in the first place? But then again, if you're able to get Keenan at half the price tag, and maybe at this point in time, Keenan has, you know, surpassed Cooper Kupp, at least post injuries and stuff like that, maybe it would make a little sense. So Rams, again, that would probably be ideal. I don't hate the Chargers one. I think you keep Ladd in the slot. You know, you just, I don't know. You can bring the guy in and, you know, what really is slot if you're just lined up, if you're the wide guy, but you're only 10 yards off the line of scrimmage, and end point of that line of scrimmage as it is. But, you know, I do think sometimes we put a little bit too much stock into that. If we have Ladd and Keenan out there, that's going to be an upgrade over what they had last year. Again, maybe not picture perfect fit, but hey, you couldn't ask for better chemistry with the quarterback already.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he knows Justin Herbert, so we know that those two guys are hand in glove, and like the anticipation, right, that Herbert has with Keenan Allen. You know, we saw it in those games, you know, where Herbert, like on Monday night, is just slinging it in there. Keenan Allen's barely open, but just out of his break, he's just putting it right on the number. So yeah, look, it would be a good spot, you know, from that standpoint. I think it could be a little bit of a concern for Ladd McConkey, because if Keenan comes in and gets a 27% target share, like, Can Ladd still get a 25, 27? Like he might still be a 22, 23, or it might be Ladd getting 27, 28% and Keenan getting 22, but there would at least be a question as to which way that it was going to go. So I prefer, for the sake of Ladd, like let's add someone to the Chargers offense that gives you a little bit of a different kind of versatility to stretch the field out and do some different things. But yes, Keenan with Justin Herbert, I think that would be a good thing for him, for Keenan.
Much cleaner projection putting Keenan to the Rams. I hear you. For all parties involved, I think that is. Let's talk about the wide receiver, though, you said might actually be a nice little fit in Green Bay, and that is one Amari Cooper, who, guys, literally 2 years ago, okay, the 2023 season, this guy had 1,250 yards in less than 17 games with a mix of Deshaun Watson and Joe Flacco under center. I know Joe Flacco has been awfully elite here at, helping his wide receivers put up some big-time numbers recently, but we're literally only one season removed from that. This last year, Amari is not happy with his contract. The Browns seemingly make it pretty clear to him that he's not going to be in their long-term plans. Has to deal with the Deshaun Watson experience for the first, half or so of the year. Then it's traded to Buffalo. Oh, great. Now we're playing with Josh Allen. But in the middle of learning the playbook, he has a wrist injury that's going on. He had some personal problems. He caught that one sweet touchdown catch and immediately had to go in the concussion protocol. I mean, it just seemed like a really weird season, Dwain. And I admit I would have expected more out of Amari overall during the Bills' tenure. But again, I think when you zoom in just a little bit and try to, look at why last year was as rough as it was for Amari, you can start to tell a better story. Still only going to be 31 in June. I know my man's was like 22 forever out here, so finally getting a little bit older. But man, if Amari Cooper is going to be off the scrap heap at this point, why shouldn't a team like Green Bay or my personal favorite, the Washington Commanders, maybe you'll try to get a lottery ticket?
Yeah, I feel like Amari can still play on the outside. I don't know how much coverage he's like beating over the top, but that wasn't necessarily really ever his game anyway. Ian, more of a guy, to create a little bit of separation early in the route, and then do some stuff after the catch. So with Amari, I think there is a potential like versatility benefit over what you have with Stefon Diggs, and so I think he could be a good fit in Green Bay. There are some concerns. 31 years old, like you mentioned, he had a 13% target share during his time in Buffalo. That's terrible. But the underlying data point, 22% targets per route run. So the issue is he wasn't getting to play, nor was anyone in Buffalo. Like Dalton Kincaid wasn't getting enough playing time. Khalil Shakir was not getting enough playing time. Keon Coleman for periods, like he was in and out of the lineup. So it was just a massive rotation. So I don't necessarily this downfall for Amari as a target earner, because that 22% targets per route run, that's in Buffalo. So when he was out there, he was still getting looks that are basically in the range of where he's been for his career. Pretty much every year of his career, Amari's been a 21%, 22%, 20% targets per route run guy. So I don't think he's necessarily fallen off yet. The 1.46 yards per route run is a concern, but I'm also looking at that for the complete year, Ian, and he played with had some terrible quarterback play. So when he did have a full-time role, he was battling the issues of a quarterback not able to accurately get him the ball where he could do things afterwards. So I just don't want to overreact too much. You can't ignore it. 1.46 yards per route run for a guy that's 31, obviously a kind of a gross data point. But I think once you factor in the quarterback play, I'm pretty okay with it. The year before, he was 2.31 yards per route run. So I think Amari can still be a wide receiver 2 on an NFL team, maybe even a wide receiver 1. At like a 1B, like if you got two guys competing. And I still think that there's potential for him to be a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. Obviously, we treat him more like a wide receiver 3 or 4, probably in our early ranks.
Mentioned Green Bay and Washington, 2 wide receiver needy teams out there. But what about perhaps a reunion, Dwain, with the Dallas Cowboys really coming in this time around to be the number 2 to CeeDee Lamb's obvious number 1? Certainly, a very productive duo with Dak Prescott over the years. You want a guy to come in and just give Dak, a little bit of help, a little bit of familiarity in that wide receiver room. The standard right now is Jalen freaking Tolbert, okay? I think we can improve upon that here, with all due respect to Jalen Tolbert.
Yes, I do think we would improve. The question is can the Cowboys get a deal done? It's like you said, he would have to be off the scrap heap. Right now, if you look at overthecap.com, and if you guys are not, why wouldn't you be? It's a great resource. But looking at basically the expected cap, if you will, once they sign all the rookies and everyone, it's still a negative number right now for the Cowboys. So they've got some work they would have to do. So Amari would certainly have to be in the bargain bin for them to make that sort of a play. But I would like him with the Cowboys. I agree. Like, he would immediately be their wide receiver 2. He's better than Brandon Cooks, Jason Ferguson. It's fine. Like, but he hasn't necessarily like stepped up and shown us he's going to be anything huge yet. So I could easily see Amari being the number 2 behind Lamb as the number 1.
And given the Cowboys, recent years free agency actions, not only would Amari need to be a low contract, he'd also probably have to last 2 or 3 weeks in the free agency before the team actually decides to like start making moves. So thanks for, your continued hard work, Jones family. Speaking of, again, just some of those real quick high salary numbers. You mentioned the Cowboys way down there, like 26th or 27th. Looking at over the cap right now, these are the teams with over $60 million in effective cap space right now. Patriots actually at $120 million. They have all the room in the world. Then the Raiders, Commanders, Cardinals, Bears, Chargers, and Vikings. So several of those teams, again, do have needs at wide receiver. Makes me wonder, Dwayne, if we can see our next wide receiver, Marquise Brown, perhaps be a target there, because this time last year, someone who we were expecting to maybe get a bit more attention on the open market wound up settling for, like, I think it was a 1 year up to $10 million deal with the Chiefs, wound up not being able to get many of those incentives because he obviously had the, injured, I believe, just AC joint, might have just been the collarbone period. Early in the preseason, didn't see him until December and didn't exactly light the world on fire once he was even there. So Marquise Brown, I'm afraid, Dwayne, that I'm going to be repeating the same data point for another 10 years because we've already been doing it for a couple years now. But he was the wide receiver 5 during the first 6 weeks of 2022, which was basically the last time we saw him healthy because he broke his foot after that. In 2023, had one issue after another. And then on the freaking first pass of the preseason, he gets injured with the Chiefs. So we have seen a ceiling here for Antonio Brown's cousin, Dwayne. Do you think there could still be good days ahead, or is it time to maybe throw in the towel?
Sternoclavicular is the injury you were looking for, Ian. I had to learn that one this year. I'm just proud I remembered the name of it. But yeah, Marquise Brown, the tell of the past for Marquise Brown has been the injuries, and really, where does the truth lie? This year, we kind of ran into the same thing, and by the time he got back into form for the Chiefs, he didn't get a full-time role. Now, he did work his way up every single week pretty much as far as his route participation. So the Chiefs were getting him more and more involved. Didn't really do well from a target standpoint, though, just because what we talked about with Amari Cooper didn't really have a massive full-time route role. But 44% targets per route run this year during his time when he was on the field. So obviously you have to be on the field to get a target. I don't know why I added that caveat in, just because I'm an idiot, but also a 2.68 yards per route run. So basically what it's saying, underlying data looked good. Had he gotten more playing time, I think we probably would have seen more from Marquise Brown. The question is, like, what would someone do with him in free agency? I think, honestly, again, I know we've said this a few times, but if he goes on the scrap heap, is a return to the Chiefs. Now he knows the offense, like he built his playing time up, obviously was building a little bit of rapport between him and Patrick Mahomes. Is that really the best case scenario here? I would have to say, Marquise Brown, the one thing I don't like, if we look at his career yards per route run, if we look at his career targets per route run, those things have all basically settled into the wide receiver 3 range, right? Wide receiver 4 range. He's flashed in short, brief spans, like wide receiver 1 upside. We saw it the year that DeAndre Hopkins got hurt, with the Cardinals, and he was really the only game in town with Kyler Murray for a 6-7 game stretch, putting up huge target shares, right? And then he ultimately ends up getting hurt, and that's the year that you're talking about. And we haven't seen him the same since then. We also saw him in his rookie season, or it might have been the second season with the Ravens, where he and Lamar were just lighting it up on fire, and he was just running past everyone. So we've seen these brief moments of like high intensity, but we've never really seen him be able to put it together over the long term. So I do start to wonder, like, is it just what it is, right? Like what his yards per route run and stuff for his career tell us more of a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4.
I personally here would really like to see them maybe run it back because, again, there's some opportunity elsewhere, but there's plenty of opportunity in Kansas City as well. I mean, we have Rashee Rice coming back from that brutal friendly fire injury, back in week 3 or week 4. He's also someone who, don't forget, guys, could be dealing with that suspension maybe this time around if the, legal system decides to work one of these days. Xavier Worthy, yes, going to be doing his thing. We all saw the performance, the Super Bowl, mostly the second half, but he had a real nice stretch run the year. No one's taking that away from him. But literally, Worthy and Rashee Rice, okay? Every other Chiefs wide receiver that had even 10 targets last year is hitting free agency. So in addition to Marquise, we have the Justin Watsons of the world out of the picture. And that's before even considering a scenario where Travis Kelce decides to, take his ball and go home, hang up the cleats once and for all. So really, again, like we just saw what happened in Kansas City. And as much as those success rates, were fine. And the stories we were all telling ourselves about, oh, well, actually, Dwain, everything's fine in Kansas City before they got their doors blown off, in the biggest game of the year. But like this team was 28th in explosive pass play rate last year. They were 21st a year before that. Like, again, I'm not trying to say they're a horrible passing offense. They've still maintained, I think, a top 12 standing in their EPA per dropback during these, last 2 years. Maybe not a coincidence. That's when Matt Nagy came out to take over the offense. But I do still think if you have a Worthy, Rice, Marquise Brown, and a mix of Travis Kelce and Noah Gray, like that could be a group that actually, man, can get them back to 2022 heights-ish, something like that. Because, again, we didn't get to see them hardly at all last year. We did not get that combination that we were expecting all year, even once throughout the year. So maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe they were just unlucky.
Yeah, I mean, look, we can't see Travis Kelce continue to decline, so that's a question. And then you got to look at Marquise Brown. He would need to step up if they brought him back and be able to show some of the things he showed in a short sample. And we've also talked about that being an issue for his career. So that would still be a question. Rashee Rice is coming back off of injury. We don't know what's going to happen with the suspension yet, so that's a question. And then you look at Hollywood and you look at, Xavier Worthy, like who really did some nice things down the stretch. And you and I talked about it a lot. He was even getting more shots down the field, not always running out of bounds before the pass even got there. And yes, some of those things were on Mahomes as well early in the year. It wasn't just on Worthy. So Worthy is the thing that I kind of feel the most confident in right now, and I'm not super confident. So I hear you. I agree. Like they could run it back and be okay. But if you think about it and you stack each one of those things up, they all have questions. Like, can Xavier Worthy take a step forward and do what he did at the end of the year? Don't know. Can Rashee Rice be healthy and not suspended? Don't know. Can Travis Kelce keep playing if he decides to come back? Don't know. I mean, so it's tough. If all those things went right, to your point, yes, I could see it working. But man, it feels like one or two of those components are going to fail.
Certainly a lot of ifs being thrown around there, but hey, this is the season for wish casting for sure. So
like my supermodel formulas I send you, Ian, got all the if statements going.
The Justin Herbert story, some might say. But all right, all strays aside, guys, might have noticed we didn't talk about any quarterbacks today. That's because we will be right here back tomorrow, kind of just, looking through the entire league, saying who could go where, who could maybe be drafting, Shedeur Sanders, Cam Ward, all those sorts of guys, fixing the quarterback landscape. So make sure you guys tune back in for that. But otherwise, just have a great day, watch the combine if you're into that sort of thing. And yeah, love your family. So for Dwain, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.